Hello everyone, Cam here. So the video that you're currently watching features my opening statement in a debate with an atheist YouTuber that goes by Non-Alchemist. His real name is Dustin, and that's the name I'll be using throughout the debate. Our debate topic is, does horrendous suffering prove that God does not exist? Since Dustin is taking the affirmative, he'll be going first. And actually, his opening statement is already available, and you can go watch it right now. I've got it linked in the description of this video. Something pretty cool and unique about this debate is that Dustin and I wrote our openings, rebuttals, and closings months ago. We took as much time as we needed with our responses so that substance and truth could be our top priority. And what that means is that this debate, unlike many religious debates on YouTube, will be philosophically dense. And I have a feeling that you might be okay with that. The good news is that all of our rebuttals and everything are already recorded and uploaded to YouTube. You won't have to wait months for us to finish going back and forth. We plan to release one video per day on our respective YouTube channels. Dustin's opening was posted yesterday on his channel. My opening is posted today. His first rebuttal will be posted tomorrow, and then on and on. So if you'd like a link to the playlist of all of our videos in this debate, just check for it in the description. Okay, I think that's pretty much everything you need to know before we get started. So without further ado, here is my opening statement in my debate with Dustin on whether horrendous suffering disproves God. So first, I'd really like to thank Dustin for agreeing to debate the topic of whether horrendous suffering proves that God does not exist. Something I really appreciate about Dustin is that he seems to take philosophy very seriously. The opening statement that you just heard, for example, was directly inspired by the eminent philosopher of religion J.L. Schellenberg. Dr. Schellenberg is probably most well known for his arguments from divine hiddenness, but he's also one of the only living philosophers that still promotes these sorts of logical forms of the problem of evil, such as the one that Dustin just presented. The late philosopher J.L. Mackie thought that suffering and evil were logically incompatible with God's existence. He argued there was a logical contradiction between the propositions God exists and evil exists. According to Mackie, both of these propositions can't be true. And so, since the existence of evil is undeniable, it must be the case that God doesn't exist. Now, most philosophers today think that logical versions of the problem of evil are pretty much dead. Paul Draper, an agnostic philosopher, has said, quote, although logical arguments from evil seemed promising to a number of philosophers in the 1950s and 1960s, for example, Mackie, they are rejected by the vast majority of contemporary philosophers of religion, end quote. Now, of course, truth is not determined by majority opinion. Dustin has presented a logical version of the problem of evil, and it's no response at all to simply point out that logical versions aren't taken too seriously by contemporary philosophers. Dustin's argument still deserves a real response. However, what I want to draw your attention to at the outset is the monumental task that Dustin has taken on. His logical version of the problem of evil aims to show that God's existence isn't just unlikely given horrendous evil, but rather that God's existence is impossible given horrendous evil. However, in order for it to follow that God's existence is impossible given horrendous evil, the key premises in Dustin's argument must be necessarily true. If just one of these premises is just possibly false, the argument fails. Now, this is why, at least in part, atheologians have primarily turned to defending evidential or probabilistic versions of the problem of evil. They aren't so bold in what they aim to show. Now, with this initial caveat out of the way, let's now turn to Dustin's argument. The argument he presents in the exact form in which he presents it is found in Schellenberg's 2007 book entitled, quote, The Wisdom to Doubt, a Justification of Religious Skepticism. By the way, I highly recommend picking up and reading the original source if this argument interests you. Schellenberg is very enjoyable to read, and so I highly recommend it. Now, in that book, Schellenberg essentially argues three things Keep in mind that each three of these things must be necessarily true. So first, he argues that the deepest good of any finite person is a personal relationship with God. Now, this part of the argument is pretty straightforward. Now, second, he argues that horrific suffering isn't necessary for anyone to form the deepest personal relationship with God that they can. Now, this part of the argument is about whether horrific suffering is necessary for anyone to achieve their greatest good. Schellenberg argues it's not. And by the way, this is actually kind of his general approach to the problem of evil more broadly. He locates some great good and then argues that suffering isn't necessary to obtain that great good. This is actually a kind of overarching strategy that he employs in his other works. Now, third thing that he argues, Schellenberg argues that God wouldn't allow anyone to experience horrendous suffering unless their suffering was necessary to realize their deepest good. Now, this part of the argument is about what God would or wouldn't allow. So Schellenberg argues that if horrific suffering isn't necessary for anyone to realize their deepest good, then God wouldn't allow it. So to quickly reiterate, the three steps in the argument are: first, locate the greatest good of finite persons. Second, argue that horrific suffering isn't necessary to realize that good. Then third, argue that if horrific suffering isn't necessary to realize any finite person's deepest good, then God wouldn't allow horrific suffering. Now, with this overview of the argument out of the way, let's go ahead and put Dustin's full argument back up on the screen. 1. Necessarily, if God exists, finite persons who ever more fully experience the reality of God realize their deepest good. 2. Necessarily, if God exists, the prevention of horrific suffering does not prevent there being finite persons who ever more fully experience the reality of God. 3. Necessarily, if God exists, the prevention of horrific suffering does not prevent there being finite persons who realize their deepest good. From 1 and 2. 4. Necessarily, if God exists, there is horrific suffering only if its prevention would prevent there being finite persons who realize their deepest good. 5. Necessarily, if God exists, there is no horrific suffering. From 3 and 4. 6. There is horrific suffering. 7. God does not exist. From 5 and 6. So now we'll quickly go through each step in the argument, and I'll highlight where I'll be taking issue. So premise 1 is the premise about the deepest good of any finite person. I'll be taking issue with the way that this premise was defended by Dustin. Premise 2 is the premise about whether horrific suffering is necessary for anyone to form a deeper relationship with God. I'll be taking issue with this premise as well. 3 follows logically from 1 and 2. 4 is the premise about whether God would allow horrific suffering if it wasn't necessary for anyone to realize their deepest good. So I'll be taking issue with this premise as well. 5 follows logically. 6 just says that horrific suffering exists, and I won't be taking issue with this premise. And then 7 just follows logically. So the premises that I'll be taking issue with are thus 1, 2, and 4 in that order. So premise 1. Premise 1 says that necessarily, if God exists, experiencing a personal relationship with God is the deepest good of any finite person. So in assessing this premise, I want to first make a distinction, and this distinction will actually come into play a little bit later on. There's a difference between the greatest good of a possible world and the greatest good of a finite person. Schellenberg's argument focuses our attention on the deepest good of any finite person, but he's not claiming that the beatific vision, for example, is the greatest good full stop. It's kind of like saying the tallest person was nearly 9 feet tall, but that doesn't mean that 9 feet is the tallest that anything can be. So this premise is focused on the greatest good of finite persons, not on the greatest good of any possible world. Now, unfortunately, Dustin doesn't do a whole lot to defend this premise. What he says in defense of it is to basically just quote Schellenberg.
The deepest good of finite personal beings in any world created by God is known to us. It is quite evidently an ever-increasing knowledge by acquaintance of God. If indeed God is to be construed as perfection personified, then what could be better for finite creatures than to enter ever more fully into the maximally great richness and beauty and glory of God?
So the latter part of the quote is a question, and we know that questions aren't arguments. However, at the beginning of the quote, Schellenberg says it's, quote, quite evident that his first premise is true. Charitably, it looks as though Schellenberg is making some kind of appeal to intuition. But the problem with appealing to intuition as a defense of a crucial premise in an argument is that it's only going to work on people that share that intuition. It's not going to work on people like me that don't share this intuition. I believe that a personal relationship with God could be the greatest good of finite creatures, but I'm not convinced it's actually the greatest good of finite creatures. I believe there are other candidates. For example, it could be that the greatest good of finite persons is not merely to be in relationship with God, but to resemble God. Now, keep in mind, the point here isn't that resemblance is the greatest good of finite creatures, but rather that Dustin owes those of us that don't share these intuitions more than questions and appeals to intuition. He needs to provide some kind of argument for the truth of his first premise. Before we move to the next two premises, I'd like to quickly remind our audience that our ministry, Capturing Christianity, is actually currently operating at a net monthly deficit, and we need your support to continue doing what we do. If you'd like to support our work of exposing the intellectual side of Christian belief, head on over to our Patreon to pledge your support. The link to our Patreon is in the description. Thanks, and let's go ahead and move on to premise 2. So as a quick reminder, premise 2 says that 2, necessarily, if God exists, the prevention of horrific suffering does not prevent there being finite persons who ever more fully experience the reality of God. Now, the language here is worded a little bit confusingly, but all of this premise is saying is that if God exists, horrific suffering isn't necessary for any finite person to have their deepest relationship with God. Now, before we look at the way that this premise was defended, I actually want to draw your attention back to the strength of the claim that's being made here. The second premise says that it's necessary that horrific suffering can't contribute to a deeper relationship with God. Dustin, therefore, has to be able to defend the claim that it's not even possible that there is a single person for which horrific suffering leads to a deeper relationship with God. So now, how does Dustin defend this incredibly immodest premise? So we get another quote from Schellenberg.
Clearly not all of us experience horrific suffering. Are we to suppose that those who don't are for that reason debarred from experiencing relationship with God? Surely not. If God is unsurpassably deep and rich, then even where no horrors are experienced, there must be an infinite number of ways of developing a relationship with God.
So interestingly, all of this is actually true, but it seems to me that it's completely irrelevant to whether the premise in question is true. Yes, most people don't experience horrific suffering. And yes, these people can still have a deep relationship with God. But just because most people don't need to experience horrific suffering to realize their deepest relationship with God, it doesn't follow that no one does. So in a similar way, just because most people don't need to skydive in order to live their most fulfilling life, it doesn't follow that no one does. I mean, like, try telling that to the guys that skydive for Red Bull. But the situation is actually worse than that. So again, Dustin needs to defend the claim that it's not even possible that there is a single person for which horrific suffering leads to a deeper relationship with God. Now, so far, we haven't seen anything that remotely justifies this premise. He needs to show why it's necessary that no one can form a deeper relationship with God through horrific suffering. Why should anyone believe that? The onus of justification is on Dustin to prove to us that his claim is not just true, but necessarily true. Now, I could go on. I could offer some reasons why horrific suffering might be necessary for some people to experience their deepest relationship with God. For example, in her book, Horrendous Evils and the Goodness of God, Dr. Marilyn McCord Adams argues that, quote, from the vantage point of heavenly beatitude, human victims of horrors will recognize these experiences as points of identification with the crucified God and not wish them away from their life histories, end quote. So in other words, on the Christian story, those that experience horrific suffering can identify with God in a way that those that don't experience horrific suffering can't. But again, the onus of justification is on Dustin to prove to us, yes, prove that no one that experiences horrific suffering can develop a deeper relationship with God. While we're making modal claims here, I can't see how anyone could possibly justify such a premise. All right, let's move on to the last premise in the argument that I find implausible, which is premise 4. To review, premise 4 says, necessarily, if God exists, there is horrific suffering only if its prevention would prevent there being finite persons who realize their deepest good. So all this premise is saying is that if no one needs to experience horrific suffering to realize their deepest good, then God wouldn't allow horrific suffering. Now, this is the premise that makes claims about what God would or wouldn't do. So let's now turn and look at how Dustin has attempted to justify this premise. The primary defense of this premise occurs through an appeal to divine empathy via another quote from Schellenberg.
Imagine a God whose empathy is unimaginably greater than that of your mother or of Mother Teresa, permitting children to slowly burn to death, experiencing with them each moment of their horror, when everyone, including those children, can achieve not only very great goods, but even their deepest good without the permission of such suffering.
So the idea here is that God, being perfectly loving, wouldn't allow someone to experience horrific suffering if that suffering wasn't required for them to realize their greatest good. The part of the reason why he wouldn't do that is that he's maximally empathetic. So on the face of it, I think this actually sounds like a really good defense of this premise. However, upon closer inspection, I think this defense starts to break down. There's a distinction that's made in the literature between what empathy is, like empathy itself, and how one sort of responds to empathy. So empathy is really only the experience of what it's like to be someone else. That's literally all that empathy is. But the way that one responds to empathy is a completely separate question. So if I knew exactly what it was like to be Hitler, for example, I might respond to that empathy by expressing like anger and judgment rather than mercy and compassion. Experiencing empathy says nothing about how one ought to respond to that empathy. So it seems like Schellenberg wants to say that God should respond to his empathetic knowledge of horrific suffering with something like compassion, at least in cases of innocent children and the like. And I agree. However, the point that I'm going to make is that God's compassion won't conflict with his perfect rationality. In addition to knowing the greatest good of each finite person, he's also going to know the greatest good of each possible world. Do you remember that distinction that I made very early on? It could very well be the case that while horrific suffering isn't required to realize the deepest good of finite persons, horrific suffering is required to realize some other greater good that isn't related to the greatest good of finite persons. So if you follow my channel at all, you know that I really like the soul-building theodicy. Soul-building basically says that the exemplification of virtues like forgiveness, compassion, and sacrifice aren't possible in a world without suffering. And my claim is that if the exemplification of these virtues constitutes the deepest good of any possible world, then God, being perfectly rational, wouldn't ignore this fact. He would recognize that if horrific suffering isn't necessary for the greatest good of finite persons, it's nevertheless necessary for a greater good that outweighs it. But I want to reiterate that this is Dustin's argument. The onus of justification isn't on me to argue that there are these great goods that justify horrific suffering, like soul building. The onus of justification is on Dustin to prove to us that necessarily there is no such greater good. Again, God is not going to act irrationally in response to his empathetic experiences. He's going to react compassionately, but that compassion will be consistent with reason. If there is a great good that justifies horrific suffering, God is going to take this good into consideration prior to creation. So to quickly sum up my issue with this fourth premise, I don't see any reason to think that if horrific suffering isn't required for the deepest good of finite persons, then God wouldn't bring about horrific suffering. Again, maybe that horrific suffering is justified by some other greater good that isn't related to the greatest good of finite persons. That's my issue with this premise. In summary, each of Dustin's key premises are in serious need of justification. The defenses offered all fall short. Now, until Dustin can defend all three key premises in his argument, we have no reason to think that Dustin's logical form of the problem of evil is successful. Well, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed my opening statement. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe, and join our Patreon if you'd like to support our work. See you in the first rebuttal. See you guys soon.